Okay, stop for a second, because there are 6 contradictions in one interview that are raising serious questions about the night Nolan Wells disappeared. Around 11 p.m. on July 4th, Christine says Warren Hudson called asking if she had heard from Nolan. She said no, and that's when she was reportedly told Nolan had decided to stay behind on the island to spend time with a girl. But then Christine checked Life 360 herself, and Nolan's phone was already back on land. Think about that. Nolan was supposedly still on an island, but his phone had somehow made it back to the mainland. And according to Christine's account, she wasn't immediately told that. She had to discover it herself. Warren's explanation was that they had Nolan's phone. But when that interview is played back and the statements are compared, the story starts to look very different.
These little liars. I told y'all that Jax was the ringleader. I told y'all. He sat in this interview and he was telling stories about shit that he wasn't even there to witness. So let's break down some of the stuff that I heard in this interview. Let's start with Warren's first phone call, because y'all will remember that Warren said that he was over at Ava's house for that 4th of July party when they all started realizing that Nolan was missing, and he called Miss Christine at 11 o'clock.
One of the first things I told Miss Christine Wells in the first phone call that ever occurred with anything to do with Nolan Wells being gone, because I was the first person to call Miss Christine about anything. First phone call, anything to do with Nolan Wells, was me making a phone call to Christine Wells. And one of the first things I said to her, with multiple witnesses here, pull up the phone call if you want. She said, oh, well, Nolan's location is with y'all at, where the house we were at. And I was like, well, no, he left his phone with us. I told her this.
And yesterday, the same time that this interview came out, Christine Wells said this.
360 says that he's on land, and he was like, well, no, I mean, when we have his phone.
So both versions of the story say that Warren didn't tell her about the phone until after she confronted him with the 360. Now, Warren tells Miss Christine that he knows somebody in the Coast Guard and that he's going to call them, which is very fucking different than calling the Coast Guard, which absolutely explains why the Coast Guard came out and said at first that they had not received a call from the kids that night. The Coast Guard's initial statement said they weren't informed until 12:30. Then the Coast Guard later changed their story and said, oh wait, actually we did. And it seems to me that that first call was most likely an off-the-record to a friend kind of deal, which means these people freaked out and didn't call the Coast Guard until after all these people showed up at Jax's house. Which would explain why in the course of this interview it went from Warren called the Coast Guard to we did. Now, when the subject turns to how the family got the phone back from these boys, you'll notice that there was a couple slip-ups.
Warren, you weren't at the house, and so you weren't there when they came to get the phone and all that. So
now remember, Warren just said that he wasn't at the house when the phone was got. And then Morgan talks about getting a phone call from one of the people in Christine Wells' group.
And how did they get the phone back?
So I got a call from a kid we went to high school with. He called me just asking me questions. He saw people posting on Snapchat, like the picture that was circulating.
Except this picture wasn't posted until July 5th. So how could this picture have been circulating on Snapchat that night? But let's continue.
And he called and he was asking questions. He was like, where's Nolan? When's the last time y'all seen him? And then he was like, so where are y'all at? And I told him, I said, we're at Jax's house. And then Warren got on the phone, and I don't know.
So they come to my house, right? And they kind of
Hold on, before we get there. Was it confrontational or was it just just trying to find him? It was confrontational already?
Wouldn't y'all agree? He was 110%. He was very confrontational.
And when did was this on the night of the 4th or the next day?
This was the night this was before they came and got the phone.
So this is the night of the 4th, yes.
You guys are missing a part of the story. How did you get from Ava's house to Jax's house? Because Miss Christine is watching you guys on the Life 360. So suddenly she's seeing the phone leave one location and go to another. Of course I would be upset. And now all of a sudden Warren is there when the phone stuff starts happening? He's listening to the phone call? Now I need y'all to remember that Warren also said that the phone was in his truck on the first conversation, as we have from this report. Meaning if we were to believe Warren that he was not there when everybody showed up looking for the phone at some time in between 11 and 1 a.m., so then that would mean after they heard this angry phone call, Warren gets the phone out of his vehicle and puts it in Jack's house and then leaves.
There's probably like 10, 15 people in my house I don't even know.
And they're all up in our faces, going crazy, asking where Nolan is, and we don't know. And finally they get into Wyatt's face, and they're like, "Where's your boat? Where's the boat at?" Demanding his address. Demanding his address and stuff like that. And he finally ends up giving it to him. We give them the phone. They have the phone at this point. Then they get the address to his house. Then they go to his house. And they're searching all over his boat, what I heard and stuff like that. Well, anyways, I don't really know much about that, but they come back to my house at around 1 o'clock in the morning. We called law enforcement. I was with Wyatt at the time after we left Jax's house that night. I was with Wyatt, and one person we were with saw that their location was headed towards Wyatt's house. And so Wyatt got on the phone with 911 and was like, "Hey, these people are on the way to my house, or already at my house. My mom and my dad are there alone, and they know nothing about this." But Wyatt's mom actually, when they were looking at the boat, they were actually walking from the boat, and she came out and started talking to them.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Wyatt, Morgan, and Jax were all together. Warren was gone for some reason at this point. 10 to 15 people just barge into your house. Don't know why your grandparents weren't around. That might explain some things, huh? Guess y'all had the house all to your fucking self that weekend. But then they ask Wyatt for his address so that they can go look at the boat. Wyatt gives them the address. They start heading over there. Wyatt and Morgan get into a car and leave Jax's house. Somebody else that you were with that we aren't hearing about is tracking someone else's phone. I don't know if it was somebody who was with the group that they had access to, or if they were tracking Nolan's phone and they saw it was heading to Wyatt's house. And even though Wyatt gave them the address, and instead of calling his parents, he calls 911 and tells them, "My parents don't know anything about that's going on. Can you send police over there?" Now, mind you, it was about half an hour after being on the phone with Warren that Christine was able to actually call and report him missing. But she was having to go back and forth and go down to all these different agencies because nobody would fucking help her. And frankly, I want to know why all of this confrontation was left out of the fucking report. Like, if this family had to be removed from 2 different properties by the police, why is there no record of that? And in fact, it wasn't until after these confrontations that MDMR and Ocean Springs Police apparently had their little conversations about who was going to be taking over the case. Because remember, the Jackson County Sheriff Lieutenant told them that deputies had spoken with several friends that had traveled to the island on the vessel with Nolan, and that when they were left, he was in the company of an unknown female. So now, even though Warren had supposedly called the Coast Guard, all these family members are telling the police that the kid is missing. These are the people that last saw them. They're all like, "We last saw him on the island." Still, the deputies said that they did not have reason to believe that there was any water-related exigencies or emergencies. Don't worry, y'all. I've got a lot fucking more to say about this stuff, so come back for part 2. I'm going to be immediately recording it because Warren fucked up pretty badly in this interview, and I'll show you.
And that is where we need to slow everything down. Because what you're about to hear isn't simply another social media theory about Nolan's disappearance. The reason this interview has attracted so much attention is that several statements can be placed side by side and compared against the timeline already described by Nolan's family. And once you do that, some very specific questions begin to emerge. Not conclusions, not accusations, questions. And the first one is still the phone. According to Christine's account, the call from Warren came at a critical point in the night. Nolan was missing. His friends had reportedly returned from Horn Island. The explanation given to his family was that Nolan had chosen to stay behind, and there was supposedly a girl involved. On its own, that might sound like an explanation for why Nolan wasn't on the boat coming back. But then Christine checked Life 360, and what she saw didn't match the picture she was being given. The phone associated with Nolan appeared to be back on land. That is a detail that deserves attention, because the phone wasn't just some random object. Nolan was an 18-year-old who, according to his family, used his phone constantly. They expected there to be Snapchat activity, photos, videos, messages, location information, some digital trace showing what he had been doing during the night. Instead, the phone became one of the strangest pieces of the timeline, because Nolan was reportedly missing from the island while his phone was no longer there. And according to Christine's version, She didn't receive the explanation about the phone immediately. She first saw the Life 360 location, then she questioned it, and that's when the explanation reportedly became that the group had Nolan's phone. That sequence matters, because if everyone already knew Nolan had left his phone behind, why wasn't that simply the first explanation? Why did Christine have to discover the location herself? And more importantly, what exactly happened to that phone between the time Nolan was last seen and the time it appeared back on land? Those are questions that digital forensics could potentially answer. But until those records are fully examined, there is a dangerous temptation to fill the gap with assumptions. We shouldn't, because a strange timeline isn't automatically proof of foul play. It is simply a timeline that needs to be explained, and the phone is only the beginning. The next issue involves something that should have been incredibly straightforward. A teenager was missing from an island. Someone needed to alert authorities. Christine says Warren told her he knew someone connected to the Coast Guard and would contact them. That sounds like action. But then another problem appears. What exactly does contacting the Coast Guard mean in this situation? Was an official emergency call made? Was someone contacted personally? Was a message passed through someone Warren knew? And most importantly, when did the Coast Guard actually receive the information? The source material describes conflicting information surrounding the timing of that notification. At one point, the Coast Guard reportedly indicated they had not initially received a call from the group. Later, the timeline changed, with information indicating notification occurred around 12:30 a.m. That creates a question about the earliest response to Nolan's disappearance, because there is a major difference between telling a friend, "I know someone with the Coast Guard," and making an official emergency report. One creates a formal record, the other may not. And if the first contact was informal, that could explain why there was confusion about when the Coast Guard had actually been notified. But again, that needs to be established by records, not by internet theories, not by assumptions. By phone logs, dispatch records, witness statements, and the people who were actually contacted that night. Christine was also reportedly trying to reach other agencies herself. She contacted the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. She contacted Ocean Springs Police. And she was reportedly sent back and forth because of questions about which agency had jurisdiction over the area where Nolan had disappeared. Imagine what that meant in real time. A mother knows her son is missing. She doesn't know where he is. She doesn't know whether he is safe. And instead of getting one clear answer, she's being directed between different agencies. The island's location in the Mississippi Sound created a jurisdictional complication. But while agencies were working that out, Nolan was still missing, and his family was already trying to find answers on their own. That brings us to another part of the timeline: the trip to the houses, the phone, the keys, and the confrontation. This next detail is quieter, and because it's quieter, it's easy to overlook. But sometimes, the smallest timeline discrepancy can become one of the most important questions in an investigation. During the interview, Morgan reportedly talked about a Snapchat picture that had been circulating. The problem identified by the TikTok analysis was the date. According to that analysis, the particular image being referenced wasn't posted until July 5th. Nolan disappeared on July 4th. So if the photograph wasn't posted until July 5th, how was it allegedly circulating on the night of July 4th? There are several possible explanations. Maybe it was a different image. Maybe the date was remembered incorrectly. Maybe the person was referring to information that had already been shared privately before the public post. Maybe there is another explanation that simply hasn't been made public. But that's precisely why the question needs to be investigated. Because investigators can establish when an image was created. They can potentially establish when it was uploaded. They can determine which account posted it. They can determine whether it existed elsewhere beforehand. And they can compare that timestamp against the rest of the timeline. That is what makes digital evidence so powerful. People can forget. People can confuse dates. People can remember events in the wrong order. A digital timestamp doesn't have the same problem. So if the Snapchat timeline really contains a contradiction, the answer should be obtainable. The question is whether that evidence has been fully examined and whether the public has been shown the result. Right now, we don't have that answer. And there is another problem, because the more you examine the interview, the more the question of who was where begins to matter. This is where the timeline becomes difficult. According to the interview analysis, Warren indicated that he wasn't at the house during the confrontation over Nolan's phone. That would seem simple enough. If he wasn't there, then he didn't personally witness what happened. But another part of the interview appears to create tension with that version. Warren reportedly demonstrated knowledge about a phone conversation that occurred during the confrontation. And that raises a basic question. How did he know? Was someone communicating with him while the confrontation was happening? Was he on the phone? Did somebody tell him afterward? Was he nearby? Or is there another explanation? Those details matter because location isn't just a minor fact in this case. Where each person was during those hours helps establish the sequence of events, and the sequence is already disputed. According to the accounts described in the source material, members of Nolan's family went to a house looking for his phone. There were reportedly numerous people there. The situation became confrontational. The family wanted to know where Nolan was, they wanted to know where the boat was, and eventually, the boat's location was reportedly provided. But the question remains, who was physically present for each part of this? Who was listening? Who was calling? Who had the phone? And who left before the confrontation ended? These are the kinds of questions that could potentially be answered by phone records and location data. And that is why the phone evidence keeps coming back into this story. Because if someone's account says they were somewhere else, but their phone records place them somewhere different, that's significant. If the records support the account, that can also be significant. Either way, the evidence has the potential to clarify the story. While Nolan's family was trying to find information, another property reportedly became part of the search. According to the interview account, the family was given an address connected to the boat. They went there, the boat was searched, and law enforcement eventually became involved. But one detail stands out. A 911 call was reportedly made because Nolan's family was heading toward the property. And that creates another major question. Why? Let's put ourselves in the situation for a moment. Your friend is missing. His family is desperate to find him. They're asking where he was last seen. They're asking where the boat is. They're trying to retrace his movements. And then you learn they're heading toward a property connected to the boat. The response, according to the account, was a call to 911. Now, calling police isn't inherently suspicious. If someone believes a confrontation could become dangerous, calling law enforcement can be the responsible thing to do. But the circumstances still deserve scrutiny. What exactly did the caller tell the dispatcher? What did they say the family was doing? Did they describe them as threatening? Did they explain why they were coming? And what happened immediately before the call? Those details could change how the entire encounter is understood. Because the 911 call didn't happen in isolation. It happened during an already chaotic sequence involving Nolan's missing phone, the family's search, the boat, and conflicting accounts about what everyone knew. And then there's another issue. According to the interview account, police were contacted because the caller said his parents were at the property and didn't know what was happening. That means law enforcement was being brought into the situation before the family had even finished searching for answers. Again, that doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it is another event that should exist somewhere in the record. The call should have a timestamp. There should be a dispatch record. There should be an account of what officers were told. There should be a record of what happened when they arrived. And if those records exist, they could help reconstruct the night. Which brings us to the sixth and perhaps most consequential issue. Think about everything that allegedly happened during those hours. Nolan was missing. His family was calling agencies. There were questions about jurisdiction. The family went looking for the phone. There was reportedly a confrontation. The boat's location was requested. Another property was visited. A 911 call was made. Police became involved. And yet, according to the analysis in the source material, some of these confrontations don't appear to be fully reflected in the police reports from that night. That is a serious documentation question. Because when investigators later try to reconstruct a disappearance, contemporaneous records are incredibly valuable. They show what people said before they had time to develop a long-term version of their story. They show who called, when they called, what they reported, who responded, and what officers observed. If an event wasn't documented, investigators may have to rely heavily on memories given later. And memories are imperfect, especially after a traumatic event. So if the confrontations described by Nolan's family aren't clearly reflected in the official reports, the question becomes, why not? Was the information documented in another report? Was it considered unrelated at the time? Was the case still caught in the middle of the jurisdiction dispute? Were officers responding to separate incidents without understanding how they connected? Or was something simply missed? We don't know, and that's exactly why this issue should not be brushed aside. Because the hours immediately after Nolan disappeared are arguably the most important hours in the entire case. Now step back. The phone, the Coast Guard, the Snapchat image, Warren's location, the 911 call, the police documentation, 6 separate issues, and they all point back toward roughly the same period. The hours after Nolan was last seen. That's what makes this interview so important. It's not one isolated sentence. It's the accumulation. A statement here, a timeline there, a phone location, a timestamp, a call, a missing report. Each one might have an innocent explanation by itself. But when you put them together, they create a timeline that still has gaps. And gaps are exactly what investigators have to fill. There is another part of this case that makes those timeline questions even more important. Nolan's body was eventually recovered near the northwestern tip of Horn Island. And the location of that recovery has itself become a subject of questions. The family's legal team has reportedly been working with experts who are examining how ocean currents and tides could have affected where Nolan's body was ultimately found. That matters because the ocean moves objects. Currents move objects, tides move objects, so investigators have to determine whether the recovery location is consistent with the existing timeline. That doesn't mean the location proves anything. It doesn't. But it is another physical question that experts can potentially answer. And according to the source material, forensic audio specialists are also examining the complete sea emergency call from July 4th. So there are now multiple technical questions being investigated. What do the emergency communications show? What do the tides and currents indicate? What do the phones show? What does the autopsy show? And do all of those pieces fit together? Because that's what a strong investigation ultimately needs. Not one dramatic piece of evidence. A timeline that makes sense from beginning to end. The independent autopsy commissioned by Nolan's family did not provide a definitive answer about his death. The reported cause and manner were undetermined. That word matters. Undetermined. It doesn't mean homicide was proven. It doesn't mean an accident was proven. It means the available evidence wasn't enough to conclusively establish what caused his death. And according to the information in the source material, the independent examiner could not definitively determine whether water was present in Nolan's lungs. Even if drowning were established, however, another question would remain. What was Nolan's condition when he entered the water? Was he conscious? Was he unconscious? Was he already injured? Was he incapacitated? Or did something else happen before he entered the water? A medical examination alone may not answer every one of those questions. That's why the timeline and forensic evidence matter so much. The physical evidence has to be matched with the digital evidence. The digital evidence has to be matched with witness accounts. And witness accounts have to be tested against objective records. That's how investigators separate a theory from an actual case. The state autopsy is now another major piece of this story. According to the source material, that examination has been completed, but the results have not been publicly released. The expectation is that the findings will remain sealed until the case is presented to a grand jury. And that makes the next stage of the investigation extremely important, because whatever those findings say could either answer some of the biggest questions or create even more. If the state autopsy identifies a clear cause of death, that changes the investigation. If it doesn't, the uncertainty remains. If it identifies injuries that require explanation, investigators will have to determine how those injuries occurred. And if the findings contradict assumptions that have been circulating online, the public narrative could change dramatically. Until the report is released, however, we simply don't know. And pretending otherwise would be irresponsible. This is where the case could reach a major turning point. The district attorney's office has indicated that the case is expected to be presented to a grand jury once the investigation is complete. But let's make something clear. A grand jury does not mean someone has been found guilty. It doesn't automatically mean someone will be arrested. And it doesn't mean investigators have already decided what happened. A grand jury evaluates evidence and determines whether there is sufficient basis to move forward with criminal proceedings. That means the evidence could eventually be presented in a setting where the timeline, witness statements, and forensic findings are examined much more formally. The phone issue could matter. The Coast Guard timeline could matter. The Snapchat timestamp could matter. The 911 call could matter. The autopsy could matter. And the contradictions identified in the interview could matter if investigators believe they are relevant. But everything still has to be proven through evidence. Perhaps that's why the proposed forensic examination of the phones is so important, because memory can be challenged. But digital records can sometimes establish exactly when something happened. If the devices connected to the case are examined, investigators may be able to determine who had Nolan's phone, when it moved, where it was located, what calls were made, what messages were sent, whether information was deleted, and whether the digital timeline matches the statements that have already been given. That could be enormous. Because right now, one of the biggest problems is that different pieces of the story don't always appear to line up cleanly. The phone says one thing. A person's recollection may suggest another. A timestamp may suggest something else. And somewhere in the middle is the actual timeline. The family has reportedly been pushing for a joint forensic examination of phones connected to the case. If that happens, it could provide information that the public has been waiting for. But again, until the examination happens and the results are released, we can't assume what those results will show at this point. It's important to separate the known facts from the unanswered questions. We know Nolan went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th. We know he did not return with the group. We know his family was told he had remained behind. We know his phone became a central part of the family's concerns. We know Nolan's body was later recovered. We know an independent autopsy did not establish a definitive cause and manner of death. We know the state autopsy has reportedly been completed. We know the results have not been publicly released. We know the case remains under investigation, and we know a grand jury presentation is expected once investigators complete their work. What we don't know is what happened during those missing hours. That's the part nobody can honestly fill in yet. And that's why every new piece of evidence matters. For Nolan's family, this isn't a puzzle on the internet. It's their son, their child, someone who was supposed to come home. Christine has repeatedly emphasized the need for a fair, honest, and transparent investigation, and that distinction is important. The family isn't simply asking the public to choose a suspect. They're asking for the evidence to be examined, for the timeline to be reconstructed, for unanswered questions to receive answers, and for Nolan's death to receive the full attention of investigators. That's ultimately what this case needs. Not an internet conviction, not a predetermined theory, a complete investigation. So why has this one interview suddenly become such a major talking point? Because interviews don't exist in a vacuum. Every statement can eventually be compared with other statements. Phone records, 911 calls, photos, videos, GPS data, witness accounts, official reports, autopsy findings. And when those pieces don't line up, investigators have to ask why. That's what the TikTok investigators did when they reviewed the interview. They weren't the people who decided what happened to Nolan. They identified points where the public explanations appeared to conflict. And now those questions are out there. The phone question, the Coast Guard question, the Snapchat question, the location question, the 911 question, and the documentation question. 6 questions, 1 interview, and a missing person timeline that still hasn't been completely explained. Maybe every one of these issues eventually receives an innocent explanation. That's possible. Maybe the phone records clarify everything. Maybe the Snapchat issue turns out to be a simple misunderstanding. Maybe the Coast Guard confusion was nothing more than an informal call followed by an official notification. Maybe Warren's location can be completely explained. Maybe the 911 call makes perfect sense once the full recording is released. Maybe the missing documentation exists somewhere else in the case file. That is all possible. But until those questions are answered, they're still questions. And that's why this case continues to hold people's attention. Because Nolan's disappearance isn't simply about one unexplained moment. It's about a chain of events. And if even one link in that chain doesn't fit, investigators have to examine it. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He went out on July 4th. He was expected to come home. He didn't. And now, months later, his family is still waiting for answers. The phone is still a major question. The timeline is still being examined. The autopsy results remain unreleased. The phones may still contain information that the public hasn't seen. And the case is moving toward a grand jury. That's why these contradictions matter. Not because they prove a specific theory. Not because social media has already solved the case. But because they identify the exact places where the story needs to be tested. 6 contradictions, 1 interview, a phone that made it back to land, questions about the emergency response, a disputed digital timeline, a confrontation that needs to be reconstructed, a 911 call that deserves context, and documentation gaps surrounding the most critical hours. The answers may eventually come from evidence that hasn't been made public yet, and when they do, the timeline will either become clearer or the questions will become even harder to ignore. For now, the most important thing is to keep the focus where it belongs, on the evidence, on Nolan, and on finding out what happened during those missing hours. If you want us to continue following this case as the investigation develops, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next major update could change what we understand about this entire timeline. And tell me in the comments, which question do you think investigators need to answer first? The phone? The Coast Guard call? The Snapchat timeline? Warren's location? The 911 call? Or the missing documentation? Just remember, question the evidence, but don't turn an unanswered question into an accusation. Because until the evidence tells us otherwise, one question remains at the center of everything. What really happened to Nolan Wells?